Thanks so much, Jort. And thank you to Jort and Jorinda for having me. I'm really excited to be here, albeit, of course, in this empty auditorium. We'd hoped it to be in person with students under different circumstances, but of course, the backdrop of this empty institution is oddly fitting for the content of the talk. I'm here to talk to you today about the Research for After Institutions, an exhibition I've been developing for the Stedelijk Museum for about 3 years now. After Institutions is a project that has grown out of research from before I came to the Stedelijk in 2017, connecting the topic of care and how we live and work as people within the context of our work as artists, curators, educators, etc. And this research actually came out of a need that I was witnessing as social movements like Me Too and the anti-racism movement have shaped the world around us. And museums and the rest of the art world have tried to kind of catch up and enact change and absorb that change as well. But I had actually a suspicion about how these changes were implemented within museums was not always maybe properly understood or felt at a stakeholder level. Oftentimes the lessons that we've learned from the renewed social interest in feminism and anti-racism and disability activism was sometimes confused as content rather than a call to reevaluate our ways of working. So I think that this is kind of really the core of this talk, thinking through what it means to enact social change, what it means to contest governance, and also to think of this as a working practice rather than necessarily just artistic content, and where do those things come together. So I'll begin with how this research started and explain a bit how it has come into its latest form as an exhibition. You can see here the floor plan that was originally for the Stedelijk's, I believe, east wing on the top floor, which it will not occupy because the exhibition is indefinitely postponed due to Corona. But the themes of the exhibition, to include precarity, thinking about access, responding to governance, are really only more relevant against the backdrop of coronavirus. So I'll talk through all of this. And I think that, I'll read the little blurb. So After Institutions examines the state of public institutions and their relationship to economic contexts and social movements, and focuses on renewing the discourse around and expanding the canon of institutional critique. And I had always thought that the canon of institutional critique combines content and practice in a really interesting way. And I'll go into institutional critique more in the talk. And I wanted to also just note that I talk about a lot of artworks in this presentation, but not all of them are in the show, so I'll kind of talk about those decisions as well. So I embarked on this research on care in 2016, so that was a year before I came to the Stedelijk and also almost after a decade of freelancing. So I graduated from university in 2008 into the gig economy, so after the recession had started, in a moment not unlike today. And I was thinking about how health and exhaustion really affect our ability to produce. I had been living in New York, and I was making about just as much money to cover my rent. And after you experience that for an extended period of time, and also, have to produce, let's say, a very long, fantastic essay, but then in the evening you're thinking about how am I going to pay my rent? These things really, for me, melded together. Thinking about exhaustion and mental health, physical health, and my actual practice as a writer and a curator. And I knew that this was the case for a lot of artists as well. So I began thinking about how important these private issues are to be able to not just make one's work, but also to live a meaningful life, and in how many contexts living a high quality of life meant also having an immense amount of privilege. And privilege was being levied or questioned on many different levels at the time in 2016, but I wasn't seeing it being levied so much at the level of wellness. And I think that this meaningfully connects work and life in a way that I found very productive. So I was searching for artists who had been reflecting on this in a more holistic way, and was struck by the coincidence of coming across so many different artists thinking about these issues. And this is where this Frieze profile came from. So this is a essay called Who Cares? And it goes into the work of Deborah Delmar, Institute for New Feeling, Daphne Maimon, Helga Rettman, and Lauren Uden. I'm not going to go I won't go into the content of that profile. It's on Frieze's website for free. But I will talk about this next essay, which was part of a book commissioned for Sculpture Centers in Practice series called Who Cares?, which was actually inspired by that Frieze piece I wrote. So this book was supposed to be published in 2017, but the publisher went bankrupt and it was never published. But I think it's, for me, a very important moment in my research. And the kind of impetus for this was that I had been thinking about how the work of curators and writers over the last few years has been really impacted by the question of how we treat artist biographies. When are they relevant? When do I need to know something about an artist biographically, for example, their gender identity, or how they identify in terms of their racial background? When is it relevant to know that someone has been in a queer relationship? When is it also relevant to tell that information to someone else? So in 2017, I wrote this essay on the treatment of artist biographies in curatorial practice, and it was inspired by an essay by the art historian Anna Chave from the year 2000 titled Minimalism and Biography. And she looked specifically on how the work of the 1960s had been a kind of watershed moment in thinking about moving away from the emphasis of the artist as a private individual, as had been happening within modernism. So she argues that the impersonal aesthetics of minimalism epitomizes, a kind of mechanical, neutral remove of the postmodern, in contrast with the kind of singular genius of the modern. And you can see this very mechanical Donald Judd to see what I mean. And this is, of course, very genius of Jackson Pollock. So while biography as a critical tool of analysis fits the modernist vision of the artist as a singular transcendent genius, the postmodern definition of art reduces that emphasis on the private, thereby reducing the effectiveness of biography as an analytical tool. Yet, nonetheless, when you look at artists associated with minimalism or the 1960s, there's still an uneven treatment of biography depending on who you are. And she noted that a lot of people, or a lot of white men, were treated as neutral subjects, whereas a lot of women and people of color were actually romanticized in their biographies. So if you think about, for example, Eva Hesse or Hannah Wilke, these are two artists whose work has been completely overshadowed in their narrative by their illnesses and deaths. Similarly, Ana Mendieta, her work has been also quite overshadowed based on the fact that she was murdered by her husband, Carl Andre. Yet, Carl Andre is also a minimalist artist Until recently, it was not well known that he had thrown his wife out a window. So parking that there, if we look toward today, what are the ways to deal with and approach biography? Could it be useful to use biography? Can we reclaim it? Can we use biography in a productive way if it's self-determined? I think it could be the case. And that's why I've also looked at the work of two contemporary artists, Carolyn Lazard and Jessie Darling, who both use biography in various ways in their work that I find quite interesting and progressive. The work of Jessie Darling, they're a sculptor. Their practice primarily revolves around writing, figuration, abstraction, and portraiture. And they also have dealt with a chronic illness later in life. And I had interviewed them for this profile, and they said something that really struck me. About my illness, I just did not fucking go there. That was not part of my practice. I didn't want to make it in any way public. I didn't want to perform it. I didn't feel as if there was a way in which I could make it mine. That was the most distressing and dysphoric part of it, that it was something that I could not find agency in, is something that I can only now talk about. So I think that this quote is relatable on so many levels. It speaks to the idea of performing illness, that we have an inability to actually be able to speak openly about illness in the first place. And that also one really has to be able to do that when you're ready to, and ideally feel supported by a community. I think about Carolyn Lazard, who also does this quite well within their work. Similarly, Carolyn Lazard is also a sort of polymath artist, working with video, sculpture, installation, and writing. And their essay, How to Be a Person in the Age of the Community, was very crucial to my thinking for After Institutions. It's an essay on their personal history with Crohn's disease and navigating the medical industrial complex, but also in a way kind of call to arms, or a call to action, rethinking how we think about disability. So the text details common associations we have with sickness or illness, and mostly that we think of it as a momentary setback on our path to productivity, or something that we only encounter in old age. And so Lazard deconstructs the adversity that they'd experience as a person chronically ill in their youth. And when you're chronically ill in your youth, and illness is seen to be something that is only something that old people deal with, or that's momentary, that creates a kind of ideological fallout. So, and also for Lazard, the expectation that they maintain a job, a creative practice, a sex life, to them was a kind of repercussion of the capitalist demand for productivity and reproduction. So their point is that we have so thoroughly internalized productivity as universally good that even the most well-intentioned doctors, friends, lovers, creative laborers have a difficult time identifying the mandate on productivity as a damaging ideology. So in terms of biography, we can potentially treat biography in a way that collectivizes private experience and helps consciousness raise about reclaiming disability. And to reclaim disability means acknowledging that virtually everyone is encompassed by this exponentially expandable term. So that would include impairments and divergences in mobility or sensory apparatus, cognitive, developmental, neurological, or mental health conditions. So if you have anxiety, If you wear glasses, you could claim disability in that sense. And in this text, I quote Lazard as saying, "For me, disability is like queerness. It's yours if you want it. It will claim you, but it can also be claimed. There's power in the realignment of how we understand ourselves vis-a-vis entanglement, dependency, and need, which can force us to shift the way we relate to each other and the way that we work." So the next phase of this research on care and thinking through connecting practice and work and life happened in 2018, actually, at Studium Generale. And I'd organized this symposium called Practicing Care, thinking about the role of care, again, empathy and interdependence within professional and creative spheres. And Carolyn Lazard and Jesse Darling were participants, as well as Myrte Berenson, who was a resident for Beautiful Distress at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn within the mental health ward. Joseph Grigley, an artist whose work explores communication and also ableism. And then Luke Willis Thompson, also an artist, working with actually themes relating to institutional critique and depiction of people of color, Black Atlantic slave trade. So I'm not going to get into all what was said here, as it was a whole day of lectures, but what is, I think, very important about this moment was that through a conversation at dinner with the participants, I began to realize how important the legacy of institutional critique is within this group of artists, and also within myself, and especially considering that a lot of the works that these artists were making had actually referenced earlier works made within the canon of institutional critique. I have also, during my own time in university, wrote my thesis on institutional critique. So again, I think that it's a very important canon because it connects the production of art with kind of a more material reality. And right now, there's a lot of renewed need for this. A lot of younger artists are working with these themes. So this intergenerational dialogue was actually the first inspiration for After Institutions. The first title of the exhibition was After Institutional Critique. And that would mean after in the sense of, in the vein of, but also chronologically after. So a kind of last wave, or most recent wave. And that kind of begs the question, what are the waves of institutional critique? I will kind of posit some in the next slides. My caveat is that this history is not so clearly written. It's not like minimalism or abstract expressionism, and there are actually, strangely, not very many exhibitions made about this canon. So this is also actually an opportunity that I had seen. I thought of, one of the most prominent examples I was looking at was Museum as Muse, curated by Canaston McShine at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1999. You can see here a Danielle Buren piece, and as well as a Marcel Duchamp in the background. There's also like Joseph Cornell, and it was a very, I think, different approach to thinking through institutional critique, but nonetheless a very, very important show. So I'll just, go a little bit through the waves that I see, the kind of working definition of the waves of institutional critique that I used for After Institutions. So the first wave, I think, is quite well known to be starting in the late 1960s and going through the early 1970s as an offshoot of conceptual art. And the definition of the institution that is the kind of object of critique is the physical brick and mortar museum. The economy was still the post-war social welfare state. A lot of institutions were still funded by governments. There was not this kind of corporate fundraising going on at the moment. The artists associated with this canon are Marcel Brothers, Hans Hakka, Daniel Buren, Michael Asher, among others. I would also just add a caveat here that it's very common for curators, including myself, to kind of force artists into embodying historical positions or standing in for a wave, and that doesn't always reflect how artists work. So I am making these kind of, I'm positing this information for clarity, but there's also a reduction happening. For example, Louise Lawler was active during the 70s, but as a woman, I think that she was not really taken very seriously until later in the 1980s and became known as part of the pictures generation. But if you look at the themes and tactics in her work, you could definitely understand her as being someone who's active within institutional critique. So yeah, the strategies, again, an offshoot of conceptual art. There was an introduction of documentary practices into contemporary art through Hans Hakka, architectural modifications, for example, with Michael Asher, text and the aesthetics of administration, and the goals were to identify the boundaries of the institution of art, et cetera, et cetera. So also important to note that the phrase institutional critique had not been coined yet, and thus all of the artistic production that was happening at this time was doing so autonomously from one another. So this was not a group of individuals who decided to create a movement. These were all isolated practices that were kind of percolating at the same time. So this is probably one of the most, this is one of the best known works by Michael Asher, installation 1970 at Pomona College in California. Within this work, and I would say that this is also one of the best known works of institutional critique, which is why I'm starting with it. For this work, the gallery was architecturally modified so that there was no door, only a wide opening on the bias to the street, from the gallery. So that created a new exposure to sound, light, weather elements, created intense shadows, variations in temperature, and these were to be considered as experiential elements within that exhibition context. If you jump forward to the future, you could also think about this literally. I guess he is thinking about this literally and experientially, but also maybe metaphorically in terms of access. So what does it mean to have no door on a gallery? I think that if this work were made today, it would be seen as maybe more about who is let into a museum, who gets to come in, and maybe even about admission. But of course, this is not what Asher was thinking about in 1970. This is one of my favorite works by Hans Hakka, but it's also not one of his best known works. I think that this sums up some of the strategies of the first wave very well. These are magnesium plates engraved with quotes from billionaire businessmen who are also art philanthropists, and they speak about their reasons for supporting the arts. So this is a quote by David Rockefeller, in which he says, "From an economic standpoint, such involvement in the arts can mean direct and tangible benefits. It can provide a company with extensive publicity and advertising, a brighter public reputation, and an improved corporate image. It can build better customer relations, a readier acceptance of company products, and a superior appraisal of their quality. Promotion of the arts can improve the morale of the employees and help attract qualified personnel." So, I find this, there are many quotes from Rockefeller and his peers within this series, which I find just really, it's kind of devastating, but it's also funny. And also the form of it, I find really interesting that actually, these plates would be found on like the foundation of a building, maybe acknowledging the architect or the founding, I don't know, person who funded it in what year. So it's very much a kind of established architectural format thinking about foundations. And I think that this is interesting that he's thinking about, Hans Hakka is thinking about how we fundamentally support art. Like my kind of caveat on thinking about which artist embodies which moments, Hans Hakka is still active, still making really interesting work, and he just had a big show at New Museum. So I would say that he's also someone that, even though he's very much known for working in the 1960s and 70s, he's still a very active and important artist working today. So in terms of the second wave, this began in the late 1980s and went through the early 1990s. And I just kind of put in a definition of institutional critique here by Andrea Fraser. This is the first moment that anyone had coined the term. And she writes that art that exposes the structures and logic of museums and art galleries is the definition of institutional critique, and that includes the social sphere of art. So absolutely everything that includes the structure and logic of exhibition display in museums and art galleries. The economy, of course, is very different from that of the first wave. This is the beginning of neoliberalism and trickle-down economics. Thatcher was prime minister in the UK, and Reagan was president in the United States. Also, it was the beginning of the AIDS crisis, the time of the first culture wars. And the artists associated with this moment are Mark Dion, Andrea Fraser, Fred Wilson, Greg Bordowitz, Joseph Grigley, Louise Lawler, a lot of artists based in New York associated with American fine arts. So Colin Deland's gallery, also Pat Hearn Gallery, the School of Visual Arts, where Craig Owens was teaching, and the Whitney Independent Study Program. And I believe that Mark Dion, Andrea Fraser, Fred Wilson, and Greg Bordowitz all went to the Whitney ISP in 89 and I believe 90. So there was a lot of exchange happening there. And then the strategies are also quite varied, but include a sense of insurgency through mediation platforms like tours. So that's the case for Fraser and Wilson. A replication of past display or taxonomical strategies. For example, with Mark Dion, he's thinking about the Wunderkammer, cabinets of curiosity, and how the beginnings of that form in the, as early, I believe, as the 16th century, was an Enlightenment project that speaks to the fact that museums began as private displays of wealth and then kind of switched into state operations. And then, within ACT UP and Greg Bordowitz, Greg was a member of ACT UP, and they were thinking very much about how video is a very applicable medium for activism, and specifically with consciousness raising around the AIDS crisis. So some of the goals were, kind of thinking about how display is ideologically charged, thinking about symbolic representation in museums, who is kind of awarded being able to show an institution. This is a very important first moment for that. And then there was also, of course, a sense of activism that was happening. And then I would also just note that there's a lot of overlap between the second wave and our current economic and social conditions. So I see a lot of reverberations. Corona has a very different character than the AIDS crisis. The AIDS crisis, of course, disproportionately affected the queer community, and it was not dealt with appropriately through the Thatcher and Reagan governments because of that ideological homophobia. But to think about a crisis of health that's happening on the same level, I think is quite interesting to kind of pair these two or compare these two waves. And so because of all of these reverberations, After Institutions really focuses from the second wave on, with a few exceptions, but most of the artist list has been thinking about the second wave and later. So I'll just go through a couple works from the second wave. So this is not the work I'm talking about. I'm talking about Fred Wilson, but specifically his performance, My Life as a Dog. And this is a very important performance within, I think, the history of performance. And within this work, it was 1992, and he greeted a group of docents in the lobby of the Old Whitney before he was about to give them a tour of an exhibition upstairs. And at that moment, he politely excused himself and said he would meet them in the gallery. And before going into the gallery, he changed into a guard uniform. He's a black man, and he stood in the gallery where a guard would in his guard uniform and watched as the docents searched the galleries for him. They just couldn't find him. And as a black man, Wilson presupposed that posing as a guard would make him invisible to the docents, and he was right. So from what I understand, no images of this performance exist, so I've included his work from that same era, Guarded View, as a kind of placeholder. And you can see also I think that the commentary, or one of the commentaries in this work, is that these guards have a dark complexion, but then of course their heads are not part of their bodies, thus they're objectified in this way and rendered anonymous or invisible. So another second wave artist, Joseph Grigley, who I mentioned earlier, who participated in Practicing Care. So he's known for his conversation piece works, and these are collections of scraps of paper or Post-its that are used as a means of communication for Grigley, who is deaf. And these are arranged in a kind of minimal fashion, oftentimes in monochrome. And this work again makes me think of minimalism, and how minimalism and art from the 1960s, as we learned with Anna Chabe's essay that I talked about in the beginning, was meant to be thought of as neutral and authorless, and how the phenomenological or bodily experience of art was presupposed within minimalism as universal, despite there being no universal experience of the body. I think that this is a really interesting thread throughout a lot of the works in After Institutions, that the engagement with minimalism is there, but then pokes this really big hole into this idea that all of us are going to experience something bodily in the same way, particularly if you identify as disabled, as we see in Carolyn Lazard's definition of disability. A lot of us do. We're all going to have different ways to encounter the world as a body. So this, of course, in the context of thinking about how our, I'll just leave it at that. I wanted to quickly mention this other work by Joseph Grigley, which is a lawsuit. And I think that the medium of the lawsuit is really interesting and important. There's a connection with artists thinking through legal frameworks and contracts, thinking about how to use legal and judicial resources to the artist's benefit and also enact social change. So the artist Maria Eichhorn has also been working on this. She had been conducting interviews from 96 to 2005 with art dealers, authors, etc., on the artist reserved rights transfer and sale agreement. So she was thinking about artist contracts as well. I just realized I forgot to introduce the work itself. So this work by Joseph, he actually sued the Gramercy Park Hotel because they had not fulfilled their kind of obligations within the Americans with Disability Act. And he had stayed at Gramercy Park Hotel and asked for a teletype machine in the 90s. And they said, oh, we don't have one, no one has ever asked for it. And then 10 years later, he happened to stay in the Gramercy Park Hotel again and asked for a teletype machine, which is essentially a communication device for the hard of hearing or deaf. And they said, oh, we don't have one, no one has ever asked for it. So then he got angry and worked toward this lawsuit, suing the Gramercy Park Hotel, and considers that part of his practice. So I think that that's a really interesting gesture. What does that mean to consider a lawsuit a artistic work? What does it mean to consider a contract, a contribution that's, an artwork? Also makes me think of more contemporary artists like Cameron Rowland, who oftentimes works through the structure of mortgages. And then there's this connection again with governmentality, which I'm going to talk about in the next work, and a desire to not be governed like that. So not necessarily not be governed, not to say, I want anarchy, but to want change in how we are governed. So After Institutions also looks at artists reflecting on governmentality that don't necessarily come from this lineage of conceptual art. So you can see here this work by Jarman that's a collage. He comes from just a very different place. He was a polymath as an artist, writer, filmmaker, music video director, costume and stage designer for theater, gardener, gay rights activist, and he comes from a more classical training. He's an aesthete. And so thinking about governance, I apologize for throwing in this Foucault quote in 21 slides in, but here we go. So Foucault is talking about governmentalization of Europe in the 16th century. So thinking about going from a feudal society to the more contemporary modern society that we know today with governments. He writes, this governmentalization, which seems to me to be rather characteristic of these societies in Western Europe in the 16th century, cannot apparently be disassociated from the question how not to be governed. I do not mean by that governmentalization would be opposed in a kind of face-off with the opposite affirmation, we do not want to be governed, and we do not want to be governed at all. I mean that in this great preoccupation about the way to govern and the search for the ways to govern, we identify a perpetual question which could be, how not to be governed like that, by that in the name of those principles, with such and such an objective in mind, and by means of such procedures, not like that, not for that, not by them. So Foucault wrote that in 97. And so this is also the beginning of a formation of critique. What does it mean to critique? I wanted to bring this in this slide of Derek Jarman's work because he was such an incredible activist. He is widely known as being quite angry with the Thatcher government that ruled in Britain from 1979 to 1990. And particularly the Section 28 Local Government Act of 1988, which states, one shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality or promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. So, yeah. This is a work titled One Day's Medication, made in 1993. He was suffering from AIDS and actually died in 1994, 1 year later. And for After Institutions, even though a lot of this work comes from this lineage of conceptual art and minimalism, a lot of his works were quite maximalist or collage-based. And these paintings and collages he had made during his time at Prospect Cottage in Dungeness, I think are, his body of work that I was very much interested in. A lot of them explore themes of death and life. They take the flotsam and jetsam from around the cottage, which was, on the coast, and makes it part of the content of his work. And then here, I find it just such a breathtaking form of transparency. There are medications here, and you can read everything that he's taking. I believe it's like antiviral medication, steroids, also a medication for toxoplasmosis, fungal infections, and it's devastating when you realize that he's taking all of this within 1 day. So again, I think this goes back to biography, thinking again to transparency, who is ready to share that information and what it can do within an aesthetic experience. So wave 3, the definition of the institution I am positing is all conditions necessary to create and exhibit art and even to live today. I am arguing that wave 3 started in 2008 after the recession. So then the economy is the post-recession moment of late neoliberalism. Artists are very many to list, but include Luke Willis-Thompson, Hito Steyerl, Park MacArthur, Carolyn Lazard, and Cameron Rowland, among many, many others. And these artists are analyzing the failure of the welfare state, reflecting on the gig economy, highlighting access and privilege, connecting again this kind of way of working with a way of life. And then also connecting symbolic forms of representation with material change. Again, I wanted to note that there's a connection between this generation with the second wave generation through various themes like healthcare and health crises, but also through tutelage. So some of these artists, for example, Park MacArthur went to the Whitney Independent Study Program or the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I studied with Greg Bordowitz and Mark Dion, or Columbia University, where Mark Dion also teaches. This is kind of a side note, but I wanted to note that there are a lot of artists included in After Institutions that don't necessarily fit into the social rubric that I had sketched out before, these artists working primarily in the West. And I had done a lot of research on artists working with institutional critique that don't necessarily exist in that kind of social sphere. Maria Eichhorn does very much kind of is included in the social sphere. She lives in Berlin. She worked very closely, I believe, with Michael Asher. But then there are other artists like Liu Ding working in China, who does not have a lot of kind of social engagement with people from that generation, Mark Dion and Greg Bordowitz, for example. There's also Park Chan-kyung working in Korea, who's very active, thinking through the expansion of art institutions in Korea, and also the function that they serve, and also Gulf labor, they're also thinking about the expansion of museums, but in the Gulf, and also very much holding institutions accountable for using slave labor to build their institutions. For example, the institutions like the Guggenheim on Saadiyat Island. So, how do we connect the two institutions of health and art museums now that we've been through these waves? Health itself in healthcare is an institution in crisis. So this was happening before COVID, but now health institutions are, in many countries just been brought to their knees. I think that Nan Goldin is a really interesting artist because she works through activism and she also has a visual art practice. And she's thinking a lot about the connection between philanthropy and art washing, and specifically the opioid crisis, so another health crisis, and specifically holding the Sackler family accountable. They own the pharmaceutical company Purdue Pharma and have earned $10 billion from sales from OxyContin. And they have faced over 1,600 court cases in connection with their promoting reckless sale of OxyContin. So PAIN, the Prescription Addiction Intervention Now group, protests against their art washing philanthropy in the arts. I believe until recently, for example, the Serpentine had a gallery called the Sackler Gallery. And then in terms of Nan Goldin's visual artwork, or kind of more within the realm of what you would show in an exhibition, there's this really incredible recent work called Memory Lost that's a digital slideshow that kind of tells the story of her journey with addiction. And it's a slow buildup of images ranging from partying friends to, then kind of like a burned through mattress, and you notice that someone had nodded off probably while they were smoking. So you kind of get this impression of the very devastating toll of addiction. And also, through her work, all of this is connected with how we govern institutions as well, how we fundraise, how we work. So within After Institutions, I wanted to show both of these sides of her work. So these kind of protests, archivalia, as well as her visual art. I need to speed up a little bit. So this work by Adrienne Piper I thought was a very interesting work that connects fundraising, activism, and fine artwork. This is a piece called Ashes to Ashes, made in 1995. It was made when she had learned that she was about to participate, or she was invited to participate at a show in LA Mocha, and that it was sponsored by Philip Morris, a cigarette manufacturer. And the work consists of a type story that you see in the middle here about her parents' deaths from lung cancer, and photographs of both of them while they were young, and then on the right, of course, when they were older and dying from lung cancer. So the piece, not surprisingly, was rejected by the show's organizer, but Piper refused to show another option and did not participate in the show. And so again, this is connecting museum sponsorship with art washing, health, etc. And then, thinking about this last kind of artists connecting institutions. This work, Ramps from 2014, is also very foundational, important work for a kind of third wave movement. So this was a solo exhibition at Essex Gallery in New York City in 2014. And it consists of 20 access ramps or wheelchair ramps laid on the floor of the gallery. And again, it refers back to minimalism. I see a kind of reference, however intentional or unintentional, to Carl Andre, thinking about these modular forms on the floor. This is also within minimalism, of course, meant to evoke a certain experience of the body, but then when you're thinking about the body being in a wheelchair, of course, you're at a different eye height. So phenomenologically, you're going to relate to that in a very different way. And then along the wall, a very important element that you can't see in this image is the URL for a Wikipedia page that she had made for Marta Russell. And Marta Russell is a very important disability activist. She wrote a book called Beyond Ramps, and there's a really incredible quote that she is often quoted as saying, "The plight of disabled people, like canaries released into the coal mines to detect whether there was enough oxygen in the air to survive, is a barometer for the progress, or lack of it, in our overcapitalized civilization." So going back to Park's work, this work I think highlights how art institutions are active participants in accessibility and exclusion and support, and how we choose to work means just as much, if not more, than what we choose to program in curators, as curators in institutions. So just to wrap up, I just wanted to kind of add with a few thoughts on the state of institutions themselves after talking about all of these artworks. So museums, I think, are kind of in a paradoxical crisis because they're being threatened in terms of existence, but are also in dire need of change socially. So there are budget cuts from the state throughout the West. The welfare state is waning, or gone totally. And then there are populist governments popping up around the world, United States, Poland, Brazil, Hungary. Donald Trump had tried to literally abolish the National Endowment for the Arts every year that he was in office, which I can say in the past tense now. And then these economic issues are, of course, very much exacerbated by the coronavirus and exemplified by selling off of collections in the United States. You can see also the Rose Art Museum or Baltimore Art Museum. Many different institutions have considered selling their works in their collections to just keep the lights on, which is devastating. So the museums throughout the world are very much at risk in terms of just being able to operate and care for their collections. On the other hand, museums are experiencing a crisis of equity and have been called on to change, but have had a lot of difficulty doing so with any rapidity. So they're the products and inheritors of problematic histories. Evidence of this is completely omnipresent and complicated by the fact that the stakeholders that are running institutions are primarily white men. And these are directorships oftentimes with political positions that work directly with local and national governments. And the people who are in these stakeholder positions don't always necessarily, I have noticed, and I say this from my personal experience as a woman, a younger woman, who's also has the privilege of being white, that I think that a lot of women, and I would argue people of color, aren't necessarily recognized so readily as figures of authority and expertise. And so how we create change within the stakeholder level, I think is very slow, and it should go a lot faster, but is also dependent on how people register expertise and trust in stakeholders. And then within, in terms of another crisis of equity that's currently kind of plaguing institutions, is representation within the collections of art museums. So for example, in the collection of the museum where I work at the Stedelijk, there's approximately 6% of works by female artists, which is not enough, clearly. So when museums do decide to do the work, and show more women, show more people of color, create socially engaged programming, inevitably we come into ethical dilemmas. What do we do with problematic artworks? How do we mediate them to the public? I would point toward, for example, a recent exhibition by Philip Guston, that rather than kind of trying to do that work of mediating what it means for a white man to be painting from a position of allyship, the Ku Klux Klan as a cartoon, this exhibition was unfortunately canceled. And now it seems just very much like a lot of institutions and directors have lost their way in terms of thinking about how to navigate all of the strong opinions on how to move forward. What does it mean to show this kind of work? What does it mean to be an ally? How does biography play into this? When do we take, or when should we listen to cancel culture, when not, etc. It's very complicated. And I would just also quickly note that I also, in terms of changing institutions from the inside, it's very, very difficult due to the fact that the way in which we are able to complain within organizational structures is very difficult. And complaint is very, very important to the health of an organization, but difficult to do. Oftentimes you feel guilty for complaining because you don't want to be seen as a complainer. And people most affected by abuses of power are oftentimes those who are the most vulnerable. So young women, foreigners, whose papers depend on their positions, thus they do not want to complain. And oftentimes, yeah, if these people do want to make a complaint, they're often seen as complainers and incentivized to not make complaints. Within the art world, we also, of course, have seen instances of this with Me Too, for example, with Jens Hoffman, a curator at the Jewish Museum, Knight Landesman, publisher of Art Forum. We could go on and on. So to end, I think that it's obvious from structure to content we need bottom-up change, but how do we do that? And also, how do we save that which needs to so dramatically change? Can museums withstand this transformation? And how do we discuss this when our access to public space is limited? I'm giving this lecture to an empty auditorium, except for Jeroen and yours. And that's great. I assume that there are some people in the ether listening to this, but of course, what we can do in terms of assembly and thinking through these issues together, making exhibitions, is just incredibly limited. So I wanted to leave you with this image of an ear by Isa Genskin. I think that this is a really beautiful work. It is in the Stedelijk collection, so she's one of the 6%. I was planning on showing this in after institutions. But I really appreciate how she's thinking about the ear as a kind of membrane and maybe a metaphor for how art and art institutions work. So it's a passive organ thinking about filtering what comes into it and kind of creating meaning out of it. And so when you put this ear on an institution, it kind of calls to the institution to treat itself as a sort of kind of listening device, which I find really beautiful. Thank you. And if we have any questions, cool.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for